On First Friday, Main Street in Thomas Riley's town always looked brighter than it did in the daytime. The old brick stores in the center of town had lights in the windows. Music came out of open doors. People walked slowly with paper cups, art maps, and takeout boxes. Some came down from the Riverwalk. Some parked near the courthouse and crossed over on foot. By 7 o'clock, the street was full. Thomas Riley stood near the corner by Dalton's Hardware, holding a cup of black coffee that had already gone cold. He worked for the town's parks crew, so he noticed things other people missed. Loose boards on a boardwalk. A broken lamp near the river. A drain that was about to back up. He was off duty tonight, but old habits stayed with him. He looked up at the neon Trout sign above the closed hardware store and stopped moving. The sign had been there as long as he could remember. It was a bright green trout with a red stripe, made of bent glass and old metal. Most nights it glowed over Main Street like a little piece of water hanging in the air. People used it as a meeting spot. Kids pointed at it. Visitors took pictures of it with the mountains behind them. Tonight, it was not sitting right. One side had dropped low. The frame had pulled away from the brick wall. In the wind, the sign gave a slow, ugly sway. Not much at first. Just enough to make Thomas feel it in his stomach. Then the wind pushed again, harder, and the trout rocked out from the wall like it wanted to swim away. Thomas took 2 steps back and squinted up at it. A thin crack ran near the top bracket. He could see it because the sign caught the light from the street lamps each time it moved. The crack flashed silver. A group of people crossed under it, laughing, not looking up. A little girl in a yellow rain jacket skipped ahead of her father. A man with a guitar on his back turned toward the art gallery across the street. The trout swung above all of them. Thomas set down his coffee and looked west. Dark clouds were rolling over the ridge. The air had that sharp wet smell that came before a mountain storm. It would hit soon. Hard rain. Strong wind. Maybe lightning. If that sign came loose, it would fall right onto the sidewalk and maybe into the street. It could hit someone. It could block the whole block. It could shut down First Friday for the rest of the night. Thomas pulled out his phone and called the town office. No answer. It was after 5, and the office was closed. He called the number for the sign company he had seen on the repair truck last year. The line went to voicemail. He looked up again. The trout gave another slow shake. A voice came from behind him. Ben Carter, who owned the pizza place 2 doors down, came out of the crowd with a box under one arm. Ben followed Thomas's gaze and said, low and fast, "That thing is not supposed to move like that." "No," Thomas said. "It is not." Ben looked at the street below the sign. People were packed close together now. A folk band had started playing near the fountain. More people were coming off the Riverwalk. Raindrops began to hit the sidewalk, few and far apart. "Can you see where it is loose?" Ben asked. "From down here? Not enough." "Then, what do we do?" Thomas did not answer right away. He was already thinking about the back alley, the old fire escape, the tools in his truck, and the fact that nobody else in town would get there faster than he could. He pointed to the narrow alley beside Dalton's Hardware. "There is a fire escape on the back wall. If I can get up there, I can hold the sign while somebody ties it off." Ben blinked at him. "You are going up there?" Thomas gave a short nod. "Unless you have a bucket truck hidden in your pizza box." Ben almost laughed, but the laugh did not last. Another gust of wind pushed through the street, and the trout swung harder. The crowd below still did not know how close it was to danger. Ben set the pizza box on a bench and waved to a woman in a blue coat. Ruth Bell, who ran the used bookstore next door, came over fast. She was carrying a stack of postcards for her table in front of the store. "What is wrong?" she asked. "That sign is coming loose," Thomas said. "We need people to clear the space under it." Ruth looked up and went pale. She was not the kind of person who wasted time. She turned at once and began waving people back from the curb. Ben did the same on the other side of the street. "Hey folks, move a little down the block," Ben called. "Give the street some room." Thomas jogged to his truck, parked behind the alley. He grabbed a pair of work gloves, a flashlight, a small pry bar, and a ratchet strap he kept for hauling equipment. He stuffed his phone in his pocket and ran toward the back of the hardware store. The alley was dark, except for light coming around the corners from Main Street. The brick wall of Dalton's Hardware was damp already. The old metal fire escape clung to it in 3 narrow levels, each one slick with rain. A gutter above him dripped on the steps in steady taps. Thomas put on the gloves and tested the first step with his boot. It held. He climbed. The metal felt cold through his shoe soles. Water had gathered on every step. His hand slid once on the rail, but he held tight. He kept his eyes up. The sign was above the fire escape, mounted over the front of the building and jutting out over the sidewalk. From the alley, he could see the back edge of the frame and one of the bolts that held it in place. It looked worse from this angle. The top bracket had split away from the wall. The bolt hole in the brick was cracked. One more hard push from the wind, and the whole sign could swing free. Thomas climbed to the top landing and stepped onto the narrow platform. The rain had started in earnest now. It clicked on the metal steps and ran down the brick in dark lines. He leaned out and reached for the back bar of the sign. The Trout moved at once, rocking under his hand. The neon tubes buzzed softly. Green light washed over his face. He braced his left shoulder against the frame and wrapped his right hand around the metal bar. The sign was heavier than it looked. It pulled against him with every gust. He could feel each shake travel down his arm and into his back. Ben's voice came up from below. "Thomas, do you need rope?" "Yes," Thomas shouted back. "Bring the strap and keep people away from the wall." "I am on it." A second later, Ruth's voice joined in. She had moved the nearest crowd back to the dry awning in front of the bookstore. She was pointing at the sidewalk and telling people to step under the theater marquee farther down the block. Someone from the coffee shop came out with a bright yellow umbrella and began helping her. Thomas could hear more voices now. People were noticing. A few were using their phones to film the sign, but most were just staring up at it. The wind hit again. Hard. The Trout lurched against Thomas's shoulder. His boot slipped on the wet platform and scraped metal. The sign gave a sharp groan. For one terrible second, Thomas thought the top bracket had torn loose. He threw both arms around the frame and held on. The edge of the sign pressed into his ribs. The neon glass hummed near his cheek. He could smell rain, old dust, and hot electricity. Ben came around from the alley and called up to him. "I have the strap." Thomas looked down. Ben was standing in the alley with one end of the ratchet strap in his hands. Next to him was a tall man Thomas knew from the bike shop, Luis Ortega. Luis had a flashlight in one hand and a short length of rope in the other. Ruth stood behind them, one hand over her mouth, the other still waving people away from the sidewalk. Thomas pointed to the iron rail at the top landing. "Hook it there and send the other end up." Luis nodded. He looped the strap around the rail and handed the loose end up through the side of the fire escape. Thomas caught it, slipped it around the back bar of the sign, and pulled as hard as he could. The strap slid through his wet gloves. He had to stop, breathe, and try again. The rain was getting colder. The wind kept tugging at the sign as if it wanted to rip the trout off the wall and throw it into the street. Thomas fed the strap through the buckle and pulled. Not enough. He pulled again. His arms shook. The trout moved closer to the wall, then slipped back out by an inch. Ben shouted from below, "More tight!" "You got this." Thomas set his jaw and pulled until the strap bit into the metal frame. Then he ratcheted it down, one click at a time. The sound was small, but in the storm it felt loud. Click, click, click. Lightning flashed behind the ridge and turned the whole street white for a split second. Every wet surface in town lit up at once. The brick, the umbrella tops, the Riverwalk railings, the Trout sign, shining bright green in Thomas's arms. Then the thunder came. The blast rolled over Main Street and shook the fire escape. Thomas felt it through the metal under his boots. The sign jumped once, hard, and he nearly lost his grip. Luis shouted from below. Ruth screamed his name. Ben grabbed the bottom of the ladder and held it with both hands. Thomas swallowed rainwater and kept turning the ratchet. At last, the strap went tight. The back of the sign pressed against the wall. The trout still moved a little in the wind, but it no longer had room to swing out. It was pinned in place. Thomas did not let go right away. He held the frame and watched the storm hit the street below him. Rain poured down in long slants. People ran for cover under the awnings. The band on the corner stopped playing. Water raced in silver streams along the curb and down into the Riverwalk drain. Then Thomas slowly loosened one hand. The sign stayed. Below him, Ben let out a long breath and laughed in relief. Ruth clapped both hands together once, hard, like she was shaking off fear. Louis lifted the flashlight and flashed it up at Thomas in a quick wave. "You all right up there?" Ben called. Thomas wiped rain from his face with his sleeve. "I am now." "Come on down before the next bolt," Ruth said. Thomas looked once more at the trout. The neon still glowed, green and red through the rain. The wet brick behind it looked black. The sign was crooked, and the old frame still needed work, but it was not going anywhere tonight. He climbed down carefully, one wet step at a time. Ben and Luis steadied the ladder. When Thomas reached the ground, his legs felt loose and tired all at once. Ruth handed him a clean kitchen towel from the bookstore. Someone from the coffee shop pressed a paper cup of hot cider into his other hand. "You know," Ben said, looking up at the sign, "most people go to Art Walk for paintings." Thomas gave a tired smile. "We got one of those too." By then, the storm had passed its worst point. The rain still fell, but lighter now. The crowd came out from under the awnings and started moving again. A few people took pictures of the Trout sign with water running down the brick behind it. One man said it looked like the fish was swimming in the rain. A child in a yellow jacket looked up and said it was the biggest fish she had ever seen. Ruth crossed her arms and looked from the sign to Thomas. "You just saved half the block," she said. "No," Thomas said. "Just a sign." "That sign is half the block," Ruth said. "You know that." She was right. Dalton's Hardware had been closed for almost 2 years, but the sign still drew people to that end of Main Street. It was one of the last old pieces left from the time before chain stores and office glass moved in. The Trout was not only metal and glass. It was part of how the town remembered itself. Louis ran a hand through his wet hair and pointed up the alley. "Tomorrow morning, I can bring my ladder and take a better look at the bolt." "I will call Mr. Dalton," Ruth said. "He will want to know." Thomas nodded. The owner, Walter Dalton, lived up the mountain now. He had not wanted to take the sign down when the store closed. He had said the Trout had hung there longer than his kids had been alive. Maybe he would be glad it was still up tonight. Music started again on Main Street. Not the same song as before, but close enough. People drifted back toward the gallery windows and the food tables. Wet shoes tapped on the brick sidewalk. Cars moved slowly through the block, with their headlights on low. The river below the town kept running dark and fast in the rain. Thomas stood under the broken awning and looked up one last time. The neon Trout glowed steady above the closed hardware store, bright against the storm. Rain ran off the sign in little silver threads. The wind moved around it now, not through it. For the rest of the night, Main Street stayed open. The art walk went on. The crowd stayed safe. And over the center of town, one of the last old landmarks in the valley kept shining, as if it had always known how to hold on.